Okay, just before we start, this is quite a slide-heavy talk. It's systems design, so I realise there's people over here, but I also realise there's not that many spaces. So I'm guessing you can't see that screen particularly well. What I'm going to do very quickly is go to the last slide of my talk, where there is, at the very least, a QR code, which just is for the slides, so you'll be able to follow along. Very sorry to the camera people. I'm sure this is terrible for the optics. Okay. They'll be, if you need them, they'll be there at the end as well, but just for the sake of everybody over here. Okay, let's go. So, hello, and welcome to my talk, Systems Design Interviews for People Who Hate Systems Design Interviews, or System Design. Apparently I've been saying it wrong all this time. But whatever you want to call it. A slight personal ADHD warning. Recently I have been annoyingly and irritatingly saying design system when I mean to say system design. If I say it in this talk what I meant was system design, please, don't ask me about design systems, there's too much trauma. So, who am I? My name is Chris. I lead a mobile development team at 1 & 1 Mail and Media Applications. I'm from Berlin. Well, from Berlin. I live in Berlin now. You probably noticed I don't have much of a German accent. We're sort of known better by our brands, which are GMX, WebD, and Mail.com. We have quite a huge chunk of the German and Austrian market, with around sort of 42 million users worldwide. The email market, sorry. And outside of work, I talk a lot about neurodivergence, mental health, occasionally do a little bit of activism, and I've got a midlife crisis friendship with crows, or as a sort of midlife crisis, I don't know. And unfortunately, god damn, talk to me afterwards. I couldn't bring that one with me, I'm afraid. It violates airline rules. This is a hooded crow named so because it has a sort of black hood with a sort of grey body. If it was entirely black, I'd be able to bring it with me because it would count as my carry-on. I think that's the last ad joke. So why I talk about system design people specifically for those who hate them. The industry is going through a sort of, this is politically correct term, divorced dad stage at the moment. They're expecting a lot more of developers. A lot of this is down to the market. There's an element of sort of saying, well, you've got AI tools, you should be able to do more. I went to a panel discussion about a year ago where they were talking about the development markets, and there was this argument that kept coming up that developers should be more full stack these days. Now, I started my career as a full stack developer, but this was nearly 20 years ago, back when server code and front-end code were intertwined, when JavaScript was the thing you used to change colors or images when a mouse cursor interacted with something, versus the sort of rich ecosystem of complex frameworks it is now. And as these areas of coding grew and became complex in their own right, we saw fewer software engineer roles and more front-end engineer or back-end engineer, and of course, mobile engineer. And I would say, actually, especially mobile engineer, it's an extremely complex discipline with multiple facets. You've got to deal with batteries, sporadic network connection, multiple devices and operating systems. When you push your app out there, it cannot be taken back. It is out there until someone decides they want to update it, and then if you want to update it, it can take up to 7 days as well. So they're all on a platform that will punish you for being too hungry with resources. So it made a lot of sense back then that as these areas of coding grew in scale as to what you needed to master and what you needed to do, that we simply accept that people focus on these areas and become expert front-end engineers or expert back-end engineers, mobile engineers, instead of being a jack of all trades and a master of none. And actually that was my motivation for moving into Android a decade ago. So to hear a panel of engineering managers say that we should move back to that was really baffling. In fact, later in the conversation, we were all talking about the expectations of engineering managers, and a number of them said that they shouldn't be expected to code because, too much expectation of a role may lead to a lack of focus. And it really took all my might to not put my hand up and say, well, shouldn't you all be more full stack engineering managers these days? But the fact remains that increasingly I've seen developers who started their careers solely in mobile suddenly facing this, in different degrees, full stack systems design interview situation. and that's why I wanted to do this talk. So let's start with an anecdote. My first ever systems design interview, it was for an engineering manager role, my first one, and the brief at the beginning was very open-ended. Build a dating app. Now, a few years before that, I worked for a dating app, so I thought, I've got this, yeah? Dating app, okay, dating app is stretching it so much. It was an extremely adult app. I don't think much dating was going on, but anyway, I knew the tech, I knew the challenges, I knew the product, and I knew what would make most dating apps better because, so my eyes, of course, just lit up, and I thought I could do this. And I was ethical. I sort of said to them, look, I feel I might have an unfair advantage because I've worked for one before, but they just were like, no, carry on. So I just jumped into it. And how did I do? Okay, but just okay, and with some very blunt feedback. I got the job in the end, but the system design interview was the weakest of all my interviews. Now, how did I mess that up? I had the knowledge, the experience, I'd actually worked in that arena, and I loved working in that arena. What had happened is I didn't structure my system building for that interview. And of course, I started deep diving right from the beginning, doing a depth-first exploration into whatever areas of the system came to mind first, rather than starting from a high overview, and then maybe later deep diving into areas. Part of this is a personal ADHD thing for me, and I do see a substantial number of neurodivergent people struggling with system design interviews, not least because when our brains are firing ideas, we often need to write them down immediately, otherwise they'll be forgotten for the rest of time. And of course, that encourages us to explore things in that depth-first way. So this is when I learned my first and probably most important lesson about systems design interviews. You are not judged on whether you're good at designing systems, you are judged on whether you show you're good at it in the space of 45 minutes to an hour. You could be the best person at system design in the world, but if you can't distill that appropriately into a 45-minute segment, something that we never have to do in the real world because we have the luxury of more time, then you might not have given them enough signals to tell them that you're the best person in the world at systems design. Some quick caveats. Firstly, there's a load of wonderful material out there written by people and produced by people who live and breathe design system interviews, and they can do them flawlessly in their sleep. I'm not one of those people. I don't think I ever will be one of those people. I don't think I'll ever find these interviews a breeze, but I hope that conversely means that I have a more solid understanding of the struggles a number of you might also have. Secondly, system design is laced with opinions, and deliberately so. And in this talk, you'll probably get a good number of mine. Doesn't mean those opinions are right. It doesn't mean that the advice applies to everyone and everything. So be critical of my approaches. Do the things that work for you. Scrap or modify the things that don't. And if there's something missing that really helps you, I'd love to hear about it. And another honest moment, actually, when I've given this talk at DrawingCon Berlin, but it was the hardest I've ever had to write, and I had to write one on mental health. I spent 2 months poring over all the notes, and at one point when I was bringing it all together, I realised that in writing my talk that lectures you all about the importance of not cramming everything into 45 minutes, I was cramming everything into 45 minutes. And writing this talk was hard because of the same reason system design interviews are hard. Its scope is unending. I can't give you everything in this talk. I can't cater for every experience level, so I've tried my best to find the sweet spot. I'll try and point you in the directions, though, of the areas that have come up a lot, but it'll be for you to take that away and look at them in depth. This might be a little redundant. I sort of assume that if people turn up to this talk, they probably know what it is. But given there may be some of you that haven't had your first interview yet, I just want to briefly look at the typical structure. Now this is a profound oversimplification and abstraction, but generally speaking, the interviewers give you either a system to build or a problem to solve. For example, we want you to build a newsfeed, or maybe something a bit more abstract, like we want you to build a push notification system. So first, you ask all the questions you need to know to build it. And after that, with a mixture of diagrams and notes, you produce this high-level visualization of the components you think you need to solve it. You'll likely then dive into the data objects for your feature, so SQL table schemas or just simple JSON, especially if it's an engineering interview rather than management. At some point, either because you're done or because time is running out, you move to the discussion phase. They'll poke holes in your design. they'll ask how you'd improve it, or maybe they'll give you a specific case or change that might require you to, make a few amendments, and then hopefully you aced it and got the job. But I already knew all this when I went into that first system design interview. Interviewer gives me a problem, I solve a problem with a magic diagram, give me a job please. And what I wish I'd seen is this wonderful quote. The system design interview simulates real-life problem solving where two co-workers collaborate on an ambiguous problem and come up with a solution that meets their goals. The problem is open-ended, and there is no perfect answer. The final design is less important compared to the work you put in the process. This allows you to demonstrate your design skill, defend your design choices, and respond to feedback in a constructive manner. Now, a number of you have done the interviews already will probably know the book this is from, and if you don't, I really recommend you get it. It's sort of considered a bible of system design interviews, and I could recommend it not only for your own prep, but also the real-life examples and the suggested solutions are actually quite fascinating and fun to read. And as you leaf through each one, you also start noticing patterns, and more importantly, patterns in the answers as well. But I like this quote in particular because it doesn't just tell you what system design interviews are, it tells you in a few words what you should do and what is expected of you. And I just want to go over some of the key bits. The problem is open-ended and there is no perfect answer. You're not expected to come up with a perfect answer in much the same way you're not expected to if you're designing a system at work, because there isn't one. That's obvious when you think about it. What you're expected to do is to solve a problem the best you can and justify your solution. And remember all those maths exams where you didn't get the marks if you only put the answer and the working out? Well, interviewers want more than just the answer, more than even just the reasons. They want to see how you come to it. They want to see you discuss more than just the option you choose in the end, discuss the trade-offs between them and why you end up on that final option. And I want to focus on the last part of this sentence here. There is no one right answer, so inevitably there is a discussion. There will be suggestions and feedback exactly as if you'd be doing system design in real life, and how you react to this feedback is crucial. And I personally word it like this. Once again, this seems obvious. So the interview gives a glimpse for interviewers, often other developers, as to whether or not they can work with you. So how you behave is paramount. Are you humble? Can you notice when you're wrong? And if someone suggests you're wrong, how do you react? Because these problems are so open-ended, far more so than your average coding challenge, and because there's a variety of solutions, you'll be involved in an exchange of very loose opinions. And this is the perfect arena for interviewers to see how you play with others. If they challenge one of your approaches, do you act defensively or do you respond inquisitively? Are you grateful for the rigor they're giving your ideas, or do you show a visible irritation? And when you don't agree and you still think the interviewer is wrong, do you approach this respectfully? Were you humble? Were you didn't know something? Were you honest about it before giving it a go? In effect, are you telling them that you're going to be a good colleague? Or in other words, I don't know, maybe the real system design interview with friends you made along the way or something. And this works both ways. This isn't just the company interviewing you, after all. You're interviewing them too. Do they hold themselves to these standards? Are they telling you they'd be good colleagues? And for so many reasons, not least because personally it shifts my mental state from this defensive, I'm in an interview and I must be flawless mode. I really recommend constantly reminding yourself to conduct this interview as if you were doing this exercise with your current colleagues. So, okay, here are some examples you might be asked to solve, but I really want to stress, don't rely on this. Don't just learn examples and their textbook solutions. You might end up with a problem in an area you know absolutely nothing about, whether that's a product area or a technical area. My recommendation is to be open and honest about it and try your best. Remember, it isn't about whether or not you get the one right answer. And the worst that can happen is that interviewers see how you react in a really unfamiliar area and how you sort to get around that. And also, remember that when I had an area that came up that was very familiar to me, that familiarity actually trips me up. So, what problems are common? If it's an interview specifically for a mobile position and being conducted by mobile developers, there's a good chance that it revolves around common mobile difficulties. Maybe it's about the correctness of data at all the places it needs to be, at all the times it needs to be there. So if a user does something on device A, will it be reflected when they look at device B? If they do something when device B is offline and hasn't yet synced, how does the system deal with that conflict when it finally does? Or maybe they'll focus on the UI. How do you deal with large amounts of the same data? So lists, how do you page those lists? How does your paging respond if the order of that data changes while the user is scrolling? How do you deal with syncing race conditions if the user performs a change in that list right before a server sync returns, which then updates the UI, briefly removing that change before correcting it after the sync returns? And often the type of interview you'll find yourself with depends on the role you're applying for. If it's an engineering manager role, you're likely to be expected to know more of a greater ecosystem, even if only at a high level. Whereas mobile developers largely won't be required to explain the intricacies of database sharding. Well, yet anyway. So I'm going to go over a few things you should do. I'll cover a few of the things you should try and know. And I know this is a lot. System design can be really, really dry. So I put together this next slide as sort of TLDR. Remember, I've got a QR code at the end for you to download the slides. You can take a photo now if you want, but it will all be online. When I first looked up information about system design interviews, I did it because my first interview was in a few days, and I didn't have time to read a book or deep dive into services I've never encountered before. So if this is you right now, this is the cheat sheet I wish I'd had then. So yeah, firstly, Chapter 1 of the Design System Interview book is a great overview of the basics of the knowledge you need for a full stack system design interview. Chapter 3 covers the interview approach, but Chapter 1 is the most important, and I still even use my notes from that chapter today whenever I need to revise for another interview. We'll go into this in depth in a second, but one of the hardest things to do when you're in a system design interview situation is disciplining yourself with time boxes. You don't want to deep dive so much too early that you don't actually complete a basic high-level overview of the system, and the later stages, especially the discussion, are vital for the interviewers to get the signals they need to know if they can take a punt on you and hire you. So if you don't get to those stages because you spent too long on the previous ones, then that can kill your chances. And third point from the end is super important. If you're at any interview where after you raised, I think I made a mistake, and the interview goes, haha, you're not so good after all, don't work there. Okay? It's so rare for that to happen. And one of the qualities interviewers will be looking for, I hope they're looking for, is the ability to self-reflect. We all make mistakes. The test is how you recover from them and learn from them. You're not being evaluated as superhuman. And conversely, if you don't correct yourself, or even worse, if you remain stubborn on a point where you're clearly wrong, that will indicate to the interviewer that you'd sooner cover things up rather than face the humility of admitting you made a mistake. So before the interview, there are a few things you can do that can help you prepare mentally. First, there's no harm asking the company about the expectations of the interview. I know everyone worries about this because it feels like you're asking for the answers, but that's not the same as understanding what the expectations are, especially given they can vary so much. The first 3 questions here will often already be answered by the email inviting you to the interview because, believe it or not, a lot of companies realise the candidates failed not because they were bad at system design, but because expectations of how the assessment were going to go were not aligned. The last question actually I asked, not so I can sort of take a look at a person on LinkedIn or social media, although I do, it's because their role might give you an idea as to what comes up. If they don't have a mobile background, you're probably not going to be talking about the deep intricacies of the Android stack, and it's likely to be a higher level system you're focusing on. Please, I know it's hard. If you have any specific needs, any disabilities, I really recommend informing the interviewers in advance if you feel comfortable. I know this is easier said than done. I know not everybody has the privilege of choice, but making sure the interviewer is aware of this before the interview means that they are prepared for it as well. And hiring managers, please put this on the emails that you send out inviting to the interview. It makes a huge difference. And if nothing else, it shows prospective candidates that you care about this stuff. I recommend doing some diagram drawing if you haven't done any before, but don't obsess over it and nobody is marking you on whether you use the correct shapes or not. It's just so you don't suddenly go quiet while you painfully drag and drop some shapes and labels across the screen. The silence is deafening. Finally, I find it doesn't hurt to check out the company's tech blog, but don't make the mistake I made of making assumptions as to what might come up in the interview from it. I checked a blog for one interview, and the interviewer was absolutely obsessed with event-driven architecture, and it implemented a really cool solution to a problem using Redis. And I stupidly stayed up all night reading system design interview examples on event-driven design, and even did a deep dive into Redis and the problems that it could solve. And I turned up to the interview, and barely any sleep, and the brief was create a web app for the company's internal book library. It was really tough to wedge Redis into that diagram. But the benefit is that at the point of the interview where you get to ask your questions, you can talk about the things you learned from the company's tech log. It shows that you made an extra effort to take an interest in what they do, but don't stay up all night learning Redis. So now you're in the interview, and here we have a sort of time box suggestion that I had on a cheat sheet. This is generally how the interview will proceed, but they're very guideline. You might spend a bit more time or less on some stages. I want to go through each in turn. Introduction, simple. You say hello, who you are, brief rundown of your career. Keep an eye on the time when you're doing that, because some people can talk forever, and that eats into the rest of the phases where you could be showing how great you are. They then give you the problem. You ask questions to gather requirements. Your job here, this is really important, is to reduce the scope of the problem area as much as possible. So I was asked to build a dating app. Could I do that sufficiently in 45 minutes? Of course not. So you want to ask for questions that turn that massive task into something that you can cover in those 45 minutes. And it also helps you to understand the areas that the interviewer probably wants you to focus on. Some of the answers may already be obvious from the brief. Number of active users tells you what scale you're building for. If you're building the company's internal book library app, you don't need the same server setup as if you're building Facebook. Growth expectations will tell you, what you need to future-proof against. So they expect active users to double in X months. Design your scale for that. Whether you support offline, that actually makes a huge difference to the scope of your system. I think that question is always in my interview. Whenever I'm doing a brief on a mobile design system interview, I'll always ask if offline is, because it will hugely reduce the scope of your system, unless the answer is yes. In which case, but the answer will give you an idea as to where they want you to deep dive, because offlining normally poses more questions. And don't assume that it should offline, even if the product you build would, because this is an interview and hypothetical scenarios often take liberties with reality. Where are your users? Do you need servers in that region to reduce latency? Supporting multiple clients gives you an idea as to how quickly they might expect the user's data to propagate across the system. If it's a mobile-heavy system design interview, knowing whether you have to support low-end devices may have an impact on your choices. Expectation response times, that can dictate whether you're building a complex event-driven system or you're just using long polling. I'd also recommend asking questions that show your thinking about the product and the feature and the value the user would get out of it. So, okay, let's say you're building an online book reading app, and you ask if the user should be able to highlight and take notes. And I know that goes against everything I've just said about reducing the scope, but the chances are that's going to be out of scope anyway. And they will appreciate that you've had that sort of product mindset, that you have been thinking beyond just the engineering sort of answers. And as you get all these answers, make sure you're noting down the acceptance criteria for the system, because you will need to refer back to it. Then we knock together the high-level overview of the system, normally in a diagram. Again, resist deep diving into each component too much. Keep your eye on the time for each one. Explain why you think it's a good idea. Also, whatever option there might be, and what might be more appropriate in this circumstance. What you ideally want to end up with by the end of this is a basic diagram or notes where someone can see the direction of where you want to go and could, from that diagram, pick it up themselves and work out the deeper implementation details. Constantly refer back to the acceptance criteria, of course, and see if anything's missing. Some things should only be covered in a deep dive, but make sure that everything that should be considered in a high-level overview is considered before you move on. And don't forget to have a sort of constant dialogue with your interviewers. After this stage is sort of complete, I personally ask them if it all looks okay to them, or if there's something they feel is missing. And then I sort of ask them very particular areas that I should focus on in more detail, which then helps me focus in the deep dive, which is next. This is tricky to provide a manual for, because it will always be based on a problem that has been given to you and how high level it is to begin with. The answers to the questions you've asked as well have an impact on the buy-in that you get from that high level overview. But generally speaking, most personal components or components the interview has indicators you should focus on. Go into them in a bit more detail. Maybe you're building SQL schemas or data classes at that point. If it's not clear what they want, it's obviously sometimes a matter of personal taste, but I'm always cautious to ask also whether I'm diving too deep, just to ensure we're aligned on the thing they want me to focus on. Don't rely entirely on assumptions, and don't assume that because the interviewers are being quiet, they're happy with what you're focusing on. And although interviewers will likely ask things as you go along the stages, there is generally that reflection stage at the end where they'll ask you questions. And the one I really hate the most is, are you happy with this design? Because no, I'm not. I did it in 45 minutes. And the question doesn't tell me anything about the areas of the design they might have an issue with. It's of course in no way complete. We took liberties with reality. We may have decided we're not focusing on offlining on a product that really, really should need offlining as an MVP. So if you find yourself stumped for that question, as I still often do, I try my best to imagine, if I was implementing the system now, what would be the most critical components that have lingering unanswered questions, and what limitations are there that might become a problem later. What did you do maybe to simplify to fit into the 30 minutes? And sometimes I find it helps to start with the question, if I had time, I'd do this. And also, don't forget to talk about the things you're happy with. This isn't just, they're not just looking for criticisms, they're asking for your own self-reflection, but don't only do that. And here's a summary of the general tips, to be quite honest, mostly for the purpose of the offline slides. So reduce scope, ask what depth they want to see, take notes as you go along because you will forget, keep talking, keep that dialogue going, make sure you portion out your time, and show them that you can work with others. After the interview, you'll really want to close your laptop and go for a nap or something. I heavily recommend doing one thing before that. Note down the parts where you were stumped. Where you slipped up, where you felt your knowledge wasn't up to scratch as it could be, because you will not remember for more than half an hour, I promise you. And then add that to your study plan for next time. And finally, I always like to send an email to the company thanking them for their time, asking them to pass on that thanks to the interviewers, and also just asking could they be so kind to provide feedback, whatever the decision ends up being. And a lot of companies don't, I know that, but feedback from interviewers is the most valuable that you can get, because they're the only ones who actually saw what you did. And frankly, it also helps you decide, I should say this too loudly, whether the problem was you or the problem was them. So final general advice, practice system design interviews by doing system design interviews. If your first ever system design interview is for a company that you really, really badly want to work with, well, that's going to be your practice interview. Am I saying you should apply for jobs that you aren't sure you want? Actually, yes. You'd be really surprised how many times a company might convince you in that interview process that actually they are the place you want to work for. And I'm not saying you need to cross your own personal absolute red lines and apply for companies you never, ever definitely want to work for. Companies that do bad things like weapons or tobacco or React Native. But keeping an open mind ticks both boxes. The worst you get is practice. The best you get is that they convince you. And don't build a perfect system. Build a just enough system. When I was asked to build an app for an internal company library, you might think, well, that's silly because that's so simple, surely it would be an easy interview. There's an inherent assumption that you become the Olympic champion of system design interviews when you can build the most complex app. What a lot of companies want to know is, can this person make the right trade-offs? Can I trust them to understand the business cost versus benefit of what they're proposing? So we've covered the things you need to do. I've already mentioned that it's impossible to cover all the things you need to know. There are plenty of resources out there, but specifically for mobile developers or those applying to be EMs, I thought I'd include a few basic suggestions. And again, avoid the anxiety of becoming an expert or needing to become an expert before the interview. Read up on it, sure, but you're, in my view, much better in shoring up and revising your knowledge in your core area, because that's where people expect you to be good. There will be stuff missing from this list. I can't fit everything onto one slide, but I actually have this list in front of me when I do system design interviews, so I don't forget a key element of a stack in the heat of the interview environment, and I often do. I won't go through all of them, I just might give a special mention to two in particular. First of all, patterns. That comes up quite a lot in most interviews I've been in. Even if your answer is always one of them, you just have a personal preference for MVVM, be ready to explain what MVVM is in a few sentences and be able to compare it to maybe another like MVP. Also, the last one, someone came up to me after the talk in Berlin and said, why do you have Views versus Jetpack Compose? I mean, who would start building something in Views these days? What use case is there for that? And it was very good feedback because I failed to illustrate quite an important point. Generally speaking now, you'd start with Jetpack Compose, but you'll likely be asked why you didn't use Views. And you could just say, well, because Compose is a standard now. That is an answer. But what they're looking for is your understanding of the basic differences between Views and Compose, so the imperative versus declarative, etc., etc. And that's why that's fair. And here's my bare minimum list of recommendations for back-end elements, specifically for mobile developers. The thing I notice comes up quite often is being asked to write REST endpoints, and that's literally just writing the name of the endpoint, e.g. book, the verb, so get, and the parameters. So I don't know, the ISBN and the example JSON schema that's returned. With databases, it helps to know the basics of when you'd use SQL versus NoSQL, and I mean just the main few points. I won't sort of go into much detail here, but the obvious question is whether a schema changes a lot for the same object, and maybe you want something like MongoDB, or if it doesn't, and you have lots of similar data objects with relations to each other, maybe SQL. I'll leave you to explore that. Otherwise, read through chapter 1 of the System Design Interview book and read up a little on the things in there that you're really unfamiliar with. And you don't need to be an expert, but just understand what they do and the benefits and the drawbacks. And here are my overall favourite resources, whether that's for the interviews or for system design interviews overall. Sorry, system design overall. There are 2 of the system design books. The first I'd recommend definitely. The second has more interview examples, and it's cool because each chapter is effectively an example interview. I really quite like Andre on YouTube, especially his study mind map. It's actually quite big. I worry that people might look at it and think, gosh, I need to know all that before I go into my first interview. No, you don't, but do check it out. It's quite useful. And the last one isn't exactly a system design book per se, but it's super good at outlining the overall challenges on mobile, both technical and business, that will inform your thoughts as you're designing your systems. But I need to know everything. No, you don't. And I think the reason a lot of people are so intimidated by system design interviews is because we all watch these wonderfully skilled people in those example Google interviews online and think, damn, I could never be them. Or to put it another way, it's hard to motivate yourself to do the slow incremental steps to achieving a full 10K run if you're constantly comparing yourself to Olympic gold medalists. Honest moments, I do not think I would pass a Google system design interview. Yet I've passed most of the system design interviews that I've taken in my career. Most of the time, you're not applying to be a lead architect at Google, so worry about being an Olympian if you apply to be in the Olympics. And that's it. Do your best, learn from your mistakes next time, and keep at it. You'll get there. Thank you.